So what if we no worries. What if we change the gear and get a little bit farther with the same amount of effort, right? So it's not that you're not doing a good job. It's just that that's like maybe not the most productive way for us to do this. So really saying that we're trying to critique a system and not the humans that exist within the system and create the system. And then coming into every meeting with these 2 jobs. I can do 2 jobs for like an hour. Like that's great. I can do these 2 things. And really saying our jobs as somebody who wants to improve a system is to get curious about how the system is working and have a bias towards mindful action. I know that many of you probably also sit in meetings where everybody has great ideas and then it's like, okay, how are we going to do this? And like the room goes silent and everybody like stops making eye contact with you and it's just, it gets awkward, right? But really having a bias towards mindful action that everything that we're going to do is going to lead towards something so that we feel like we're not just sitting in a room venting and like, because that is necessary and like appropriate in some spaces, but in our improvement work, we want to make sure that everything that we're doing is leading towards some type of change in our system. So I then come to my favorite tool, which I acknowledge that this is a lot of words. Rayanne is recording the session as well as I have all of the slides that you will receive after the session, so you don't have to worry about writing all these down. But these are taken from William Edward Deming's, I don't remember what he first called them, but we call them the 4 lenses of curiosity, which are 4 different ways that we can look through our system and say all of these are important to work together. And these are 4 different ways that we can see how things are functioning. So the first one is appreciation of a system. So we need to appreciate or understand how the system is functioning before we go about changing it. How are we understanding the impact of our actions on the community? What may be some unintended consequences of our actions? What parts of the system are dependent on one another? And if we do blank, it will result in blank. So these are really good questions. Appreciation of a system is really good questions when we're thinking about what is something small that we can try in our system, but we need to know what's going to happen. And we don't need to know everything that's going to happen, but we need to start asking those questions. The second thing is understanding variation. So how are we using data to inform our efforts? What's happening in our data? What is special cause and what is common cause? Which for those who don't sit in data land all the time, special cause is something that creates a variation in the system that you can pinpoint, that you cannot pinpoint why it's happening. So we see an increase in the number of people experiencing homelessness. We don't necessarily know why. Common cause is when we can necessarily link it to something else that's happening within the environment. So in Spokane, we see an increase in people experiencing homelessness or people accessing our shelters. We look at the calendar, it's October. Okay, like this makes sense. It's getting colder and like more people are seeking out shelters. Where special cause would be that we're seeing an increase in people using our shelters, but it's the middle of summer and I'm not really sure what's going on here. And how might we be increasing variation with our actions? So how might something that we try create something different in our data? Is this intended or is this unintended? Intended would be we're seeing an increase in housing placements because we tried X, Y, and Z. The third thing, is building knowledge. How are we learning and adapting? How do we know what we know to be true? This is one of my favorite questions to ask in a group setting of when somebody says a comment, and I'm going to keep coming back to rapid rehousing. I don't know why, this is just where my brain is right now. Of we are seeing people enter rapid, they're stable for about 6 months, and then they're returning to homelessness. And it's because they can't afford their rent and rapid wasn't the right program for them. Then returning to that and saying, how do you know that to be true? Like, can you show me the data on that? You can believe that's true, and like that is great, but what is leading you to that assumption, right? So asking those questions of how do we know what we know to be true, and is there data, or is there, and data can be both empirical and experiential. And so how do we know that this is happening in our community? And how do we move from fixing and minimizing to learning and a growth mindset? So I think something that we often encounter when we're trying to do systems change is people want to be 100% sure before we try and change something. And a great question that I like to ask is, what's the worst thing that can happen? We try this, or what are you afraid is going to happen? So we are going to say that, I'm trying to think of a good example right now and I can't. I'm encouraging people to try and prioritize people over 60 for permanent supportive housing. And everybody will say, that's not going to work. That's not going to create the change that we want to see, right? That's not going to fix our problem. But what are we going to learn if we try to do that? What more information are we going to have in order to come up with a better solution if we try to do this? Also, what's the worst thing that can happen if we try this? And if the worst thing that can happen is that more people get housed that need housing, and I don't see that as an issue, right? If the worst thing that can happen is that we're going to detrimentally affect individuals in our system, that's an issue. Like, that's something that we shouldn't try. But if the worst thing that can happen is somebody gets housed and we learn something, that's an opportunity for us to keep moving forward in systems change. And the fourth part is my favorite part, the human side of change. So how are we engaging others in our efforts? What are people's motivations to change? How do we make it easy to change? How are we understanding and distributing power across our leaders? How can we make the way we work together an example of what is possible in other spaces? Which leads us to, like, how do we do all of this? And I constantly come back to the PDSA cycle, or the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle. It's a shorthand for testing change in the real work setting. We plan something, we try it, we observe the results, and then we act on what is learned. Now, the big thing that I want to say with this is small tests of change. One of my favorite ways to use this is the Tuesday test. What can we try by next Tuesday in order to see a result? And when we ask that question, it means that we're not looking for you to flip a program on its head. I want you to do it with one person and see how that happened. 2 people. Like, is it possible for us to ask one person to fill out an additional sheet of information at their intake that gives us some data about their previous homeless history or housing history by next Tuesday? Like, is that possible? If it's not possible in that short time period, then we're thinking too big. So going to really small things and saying, did this work? Did this not work? Maybe it worked for one person. Okay, now can we try like 5 people? Oh, 5 people is too many. Okay, can we try 3 people? Like, really adapting on that and then scaling up. If it's working, if it's not working, and you're like, that was a disaster, scaling back and saying, like, great, we tried that, we learned something, recording what we learned so that we're not trying it again in 3 years, and moving forward from there. Oops, I jumped to the end, sorry. So some helpful questions in getting curious is, what would happen if we tried X, Y, or Z? What are you afraid would happen if we tried X, Y, or Z? It's really great to tap into people's fear and say, it's valid. Like, I'm afraid of things too happening for the worse. Like, let's name what we're afraid of and see how we can move past that. As it is now, is this program working for participants, or are we asking participants to work for the program? What can we do to change that? What additional pieces of information do we need to make a decision? And what would it take to learn that? So really just asking a lot of questions, getting really curious about how our system is working and what we need to do for change. So now I want to move into the second element of this. So we're getting really curious, we're asking questions, we're starting to engage in the process of systems change. And now we need to take a look around the table and see who is getting really curious at the process of systems change. Who are we listening to in this process? And do they have experience living through this system? So people with lived experience of homelessness are experts in how our homeless services systems function and should be treated and paid like such. I like to say that they have a PhD in their lived experience of how our system functions. And we want to encourage ways for them to be brought to the table in a mindful, respectful, trauma-informed way so that we can make a better system for those that come after them. So why including people with lived experience matters? And again, I'm seeing a lot of head nods, so I'm thinking I'm speaking to individuals who know that this matters, but people with lived experience are powerful advocates for change. Leaders with lived experience drive advocacy efforts and make policy that addresses the systematic problems. People with lived experience know what is broken. They have lived through what is broken in our systems and have the knowledge of what it would take to solve the issue for them, right? We're acknowledging that they are an expert in their lived experience and this is what could be different for them, but also using that when you encourage them to come together, then they can see other people's experiences and know and come up with the solutions that we can use in our community. So ending homelessness is tied to systems leaders seeking regular feedback about what is broken, getting curious, implementing ideas for the solution as soon as possible and feasible, and transparently measuring progress to stop doing what doesn't work and do more of what works. That's ultimately what we're trying to do as advocates for systems change, is stop doing what's not working and start doing more of what is working. And I know that's simplistic and sounds really easy, but partnering with people with lived experience is essential to addressing systemic racial inequities in our community. Insights from Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are disproportionately impacted by homelessness are essential. I will also add, I don't know if I'm pretty sure that it's across the state and across the country, partnering with people, with members of the LGBTQ plus community, and engaging their lived experience of homelessness is also essential to ending disproportionality. So the first part of engaging is we want to make sure that we're doing it in an ethical way, in compassionate way, in a way that is going to be beneficial for both parties, right? So we want to ensure that interviewers or engagement specialists, whatever you want to call them, are working from a trauma-informed approach. I know that the word trauma-informed is thrown around a lot these days, but making sure that we're really addressing understanding, like, what is a window of tolerance? How can we see when somebody is bumping up against the top of their window or going down below their window, right? And how can we make sure that our engagement with them is appropriate and responsive to their reactions in the window? How can we understand that sometimes these questions, even if it's a yes/no question, even if it seems seemingly disengaged from their past, is going to bring things up, and we want a compassionate response to that. We don't want any expertise that comes at the cost of re-traumatizing a person with lived experience. If that is a byproduct of our engagement with them, that's not helpful for our systems change. We want to lay out clear expectation and guidelines for all interactions. How much time is the individual expected to contribute? Is this a one-time or an ongoing commitment? What area of the system are we specifically trying to understand in this meeting? And setting up these clear expectations before the actual meeting occurs, so that we can make sure that everyone in the room has had time to prepare and knows exactly what is expected of them, which will then kind of de-escalate some of that bodily response to unknown or anxiety that can come with engaging. Transparency of how and where the information is being used. This includes fostering the participants' ability to present for themselves. I always try to give a person with lived experience the option of sharing their own story in the space that we're trying to use the information before I say, I'm going to take it forward for you. And making sure that if they do choose that they want to share their own story, they are prepared for it. There's an opportunity to debrief with them and that you are there to support them during the engagement. Also trying to start with somebody that you know is going to be compassionate and understanding. I think that is kind of common sense, but transparency of how and where the information is being used if they are not there in that setting. The biggest thing, this information is going to in no way affect your ability to receive services in the future should you need them, or your ability to continue engaging with the program that you're working in. It's completely separate, right? Because I'm going to say things very differently if I think that my housing is at jeopardy than I would if I know and am continually reminded that this information is going to be separated from my name and my identifying information and is in no way going to affect my housing. And then meaningfully compensating the individual for their time and expertise. This includes transparency about how and when this income becomes taxable, if they need to report it as income to their program, and information about free tax resources if they need it. I know that this seems disconnected from it, but understanding what this means if we are compensating individuals, which I 100% believe that we should be, but also making sure that they are understanding what the consequences are. For most individuals, if you make less than $600 a year, it does not count as income. It is a stipend. So in our program, which I will get to in a minute, we keep track for the participant. And when they hit about $500, we say, hey, a reminder, this income has to be reported as income to both your program and to the government if you go over $600. We would love to keep you in and keep learning from you. We also understand if you need to step back until next year and then you want to re-engage with us then, or if you want to be done. but meaningfully compensating the individual for their time. And then the last thing is sharing the results of change that come from the work that they're doing. A lot of times I hear individuals say, I have been asked for my story 7 million times and I haven't seen anything happen with it. Like, why do you keep asking me if nothing's going to change? And this is the small things too. One of the really exciting pieces of work that I'm working on right now is with our veterans in Spokane, and they believe that there's a need to get the word out about veteran programs, because it can be really hard for somebody to know that they're eligible for a veteran program, and get engaged with that system. So saying like, hey, I heard you, and now we're going to start working on this. And like, do any of you want to design a poster? Because this agency is willing to help us print posters, because that's what you said y'all thought would be effective. So sharing even the small things with them and continually engaging them along the way. So I've talked a little bit about my experience and how this is integrated in my community. Rand, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to, there was a question in the chat that I think was just wanting you to reiterate or be a little bit more specific about the idea of paying participants. So the question is, are you really saying that we can pay our housing client partners? So I think, is it this part that you'll talk about where that money comes from, or is that, okay?
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, I am really saying that we can pay participants in programs for their expertise. So getting into this Spokane model, we have 3 different advisory committees of people with lived experience, all of which are engaged at least on a monthly basis and compensated with the matrix that you can see on the side of your screen. So we pay on average $20 an hour for people with lived experience to be engaging in our system. This money comes from a couple different places. The vast majority of it is through partnerships with private philanthropy, which we really appreciate that money because it has no strings attached to it and is the easiest to kind of work with, but it's also the hardest to get. If you work with youth and young adults specifically, the Office of Homeless Youth also does allow for stipends of people with lived stipends for youth to be engaged with the system. I believe that the Washington State Department of Commerce is also looking at how to expand that to single adults, because right now Department of Commerce is specifically focused on stipends for families and youth. The other, sorry, my voice a little bit. The other place is it can come out of your COC's planning dollars. So if your COC decides that this is a priority, some of the planning dollars are approved by HUD to be paying and engaging people with lived experience at a consultant rate for their work, which I know those planning dollars are valuable to a lot of COCs. And so asking for a part of them can be difficult, but there are ways to kind of move money around so that you free up more planning dollars, and then use those to engage people with lived experience on your different committees and your different ways of engaging with them. So as I mentioned, Spokane has 3 different advisory groups that we use. We have our Youth Advisory Board, which are open meetings for youth and young adults with lived experience. They are bi-weekly. The chair of the Youth Advisory Board also sits as a person with lived experience on our COC, and it is integrated into the YHDP project and the Anchor Community Initiative work that is happening in the Spokane community. The second one is the Veteran Advisory Committee, which I work really closely with. It is 8 to 12 veterans with lived experience of homelessness, all are individually interviewed before joining the committee, so it's not an open meeting like the Youth Advisory Board. They all are invited to join. They meet monthly, and they present quarterly to a decision maker. So whether it is the heads of the veteran programs or somebody at our COC or all of those different things, they present quarterly on the work that they're doing and recommendations that they have for the system. They also have a member that sits on the COC board as a voting member of the COC. And then our third one is the Women's Leadership Group, which is open meetings. So again, anybody can come. For anyone who identifies as female, so this does not have to be a, it's anybody who identifies as female in our single adult system. So the only thing that we ask is it's not a parenting female, because those are technically in our family system. But anybody who is a single adult, and it's currently focused on shelter systems and safety issues for individuals who identify as female in our community. This group also meets monthly, and the hope is eventually to get them to the point that they have a member on the COC board as well, a voting member on the COC board. The last thing is the RFP committees. So this is something that Spokane is working towards. I cannot say that we are 100% doing this right now, but we are trying really hard, is that we have 1 to 2 members from every individual advisory committee that assist in reviewing RFPs for COC projects. And something that we're hoping to move towards is that providers actually sit across the table from our panel of people with lived experience and have to answer questions about their project, specifically when it's a new project coming into our community, to the individuals who have the lived experience and are engaging with their community. So it is still information and becoming official in our region. I think the last thing that I wanted to touch on is all timeframes include travel time for participants and any prep time that they may need for the specific meeting. That's why it's 0 to 2 hours, because we'll have a 1-hour meeting and we want to include 30 minutes on either side for travel time and any prep that they need to do for that meeting. The last piece I do want to get into here really quick so that we have ample time for questions, and then I'm happy to talk more about engaging people with lived experience of homelessness, is collaboration is key. No one program or provider is able to end homelessness alone, but each are a piece of the puzzle. So starting with language, moving from mine to ours. Language is important. And I will get into a wrestling match with anybody who says it's not. Mindset shifts begin with a shift in our language. So moving from like, this is my client, to like, this is our neighbor experiencing homelessness, can be powerful in how we go about doing systems change. Getting provider feedback and buy-in. Allowing them to say, this part of this process sucks. Like, can we change it? And being like, either it's supposed to suck for you right now, like, I'm sorry, but like, I want you to be a little bit uncomfortable, or like, yeah, I understand that this sucks. Let's change that. And then the last thing is making the implicit explicit. So anything that we think is an implicit understanding across the community is something that we should really focus on getting explicit. A current example I have of that is even this notion of permanent housing. I asked a group of providers to define what permanent housing was, because we should all know what permanent housing is. The difference in answers that I got was really good information that now I need to be very explicit about what I'm talking about when I say permanent housing or stable housing or housing in general, right? Like, we need to be very explicit about what we are talking about. Define what collaboration means in your community. Can there be a shared space for providers to come together and share information? Or is it up to the case manager or provider to reach out to another case manager? Neither one of these is the right way to do it, but we need to define what we mean by collaboration in our community. And then setting a shared aim. What is it that we are trying to accomplish? And what is each of our roles in getting there? So we're all trying to accomplish something together. What is my part in doing that? And what is your part in doing that? But we're trying to move towards the same thing. And then continually returning to a learning or growth mindset. I think that's said it. And then remembering that some providers may not be as ready to share information or collaborate as others are. The more you lead providers to work as a unit, the more likely you are to use everyone's strengths to house clients effectively. Just them showing up is a step, right? It would be really helpful if everybody was willing to like show up and say, here are all my clients, who else is working with them? But maybe the first step is that they're in the room and they identify, I am working with that client as well. I don't really want to share exactly where they're camping because I'm unsure of the safety in here. And we say, oh, cool. So-and-so is also working in with that person. Can you two meet in a separate space and have a more like safe conversation for you? And then we're still using their strengths and we're coaxing them that this is a safe environment that we want to challenge by choice. We want to challenge you to be collaborative in a way that you're comfortable. So kind of what I was alluding to is this option of case conferencing. So getting providers across the system together to talk about either hard cases or cases that just need some extra work, or cases that we know that multiple people are working with this participant. How can we collaborate on what we're doing? So in my community, we do case conferencing bi-weekly for veterans and chronic single adults, and weekly for youth and young adults. It is a space to really share and say like, hey, I am really struggling with getting X, Y, and Z document so that I can move this client into housing. Does anybody have experience with that? Or does anybody know where I should point this client towards these things? And making sure that we can capitalize on everybody's superpowers, because everybody brings something different to this community and they have those skills that we should be able to utilize in moving forward. So setting expectations, providers are more open to sharing if that means they may house a client easier and faster as a result. So really being clear, again, making the implicit explicit of why is this valuable to you. Frame the meeting as a place where opportunity for mutual supports are identified and used. Clearly frame your role as a facilitator. Explain that you ask questions about each client to get on specific barriers and opportunities, not to establish authority. Talk about the meeting as a space for the group to capitalize on everyone's superpowers and reflect the fact that some providers have had to work alone for a long time, and that this is a space that we're developing shared responsibility for housing each client. We acknowledge that it has been an environment that everybody's kind of been for themselves for a little bit, and I think that's exacerbated during the pandemic. So how can we say that, yes, that's valid, that is what you've had experience with, can we try something new? And then strategies to facilitate for problem solving. Ask clarifying and open questions using non-authoritative language. Develop a strong inventory of what each person can offer to others within the case conferencing group. You can use team strengthening time in the agenda at one meeting for this. And then look for specific opportunities to make concrete connections between the group. For example, if a client is using in a housing navigation, so they're like really trying to find, they have a voucher and they're trying to find their unit, and your clarifying question reveals needs for units, suggest that a provider from another agency helps out with this action step, if that is what comes up. And then I think the last thing is rewarding collaboration. More enticing for providers to work together and share information for success. Asking questions like, what is a resource, skill, or relationship that exists in this community that would make your job easier? How can we tap into a relationship that already exists and leverage those resources? And then moving to a systemic view. What barriers in reporting or program metrics make it difficult to collaborate amongst providers? This could be that only one agency in your community can name that housing placement for a client. And so it's not easy to collaborate amongst providers because only one of you is going to get credit for it. And so why would I want to share with everyone else? Who creates or enforces that barrier? So where is that barrier? Who creates and enforces it? And then what would it look like if it's not there? How can we move to what are small steps that we can take in engaging in conversation with whoever creates that barrier to try and remove it? And then leveraging community data to celebrate wins across the community. Are we able to see when there has been a reduction in homelessness or an increase in housing placements or whatever across the community and celebrate that? This could even be looking at last year's point in time count and looking at this year's point in time count and saying, hey, our percentage of people of color experiencing homelessness in our system has gone down. That's not one program's responsibility. That is everybody in the community. How do we celebrate that as a community rather than only looking at program metrics for one program? Because again, we want to see the collaborative effort of our whole community. So I wanted to leave enough time for questions, and I know I just threw a lot of information at y'all, and I'm happy to go back to any slides that would be helpful.
Thank you, Morgan. I had one question that kind of came out of some other folks' questions or inquiries. When you're working with individuals and say like the community knows that, right, the community is saying, yes, we want folks with lived experience to be at the table. Yes, we want that. And maybe the actions, you aren't seeing it, but as an individual, maybe you feel really small in that kind of game. What are some techniques that folks can do in those types of scenarios?
Yeah. I think starting with, do you have a relationship with a client that you can tap into and try and highlight their voice or experience, right? If your system isn't set up to have a full compensation structure and formal reporting and like who are they accountable to and all of those things, how can you say, no, you know what, I have a really good relationship with this individual and I want to foster and I think they have really good things to say. So like, how can I have conversation with them in a way that with their permission, right, bring those things back up to the community as a whole and say, look at how much more we're learning from having this person at the table or having this person's voice at the table if they're not physically at the table. And starting small, because you are one person, but you do have the ability to create that change and make that expectation. I think the second thing would be challenging the assumption of going back to that, hey, we're seeing that this is the experience of a lot of people, and saying, where did you hear that? How do you know that to be true? Have you heard that from a participant or a person with lived experience of homelessness? Because if you haven't, I would like you saying, hey, can we have a conversation with 5 individuals experiencing homelessness and see if what you're thinking to be true is actually what's happening in our system, and encouraging small ways for bringing the voice of those with lived experience into the conversation, and then trying to scale up from there into a more formal model.
You guys are welcome to put questions in the chat or message me individually if you'd like to not ask them out loud like that. I did have one question that has come up, from years of working with folks. Sometimes the individuals who are the most affected by the system not working are individuals who have maybe some really complex challenges. And so going into a meeting or that kind of space, they might not be perceived as the most welcoming. And so I know for a lot of folks, me included, it was really nerve-wracking sometimes to be like, let's go try this. And they might not present as the most stable, right, or how someone expects them to present. Are there some trauma-informed ways to go about that? Or does any of your cycles or whatever speak to that piece about how to empower those individuals because they're impacted the most, but might be a little bit more of a challenge?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I would do is start with individuals that you know are going to be safe and responsive, which this may feel like a step of like, well, this individual already knows exactly what's happening. But if you give both the participant the ability to have experience going into a space like that, and then you can build up to different spaces, you also then give the participant credibility of they have already met with some people whose names might carry particular weight in the community or have authority or all of those things, and say, hey, like, this person is listening to them, like maybe we can as well. I think the other thing is trying to find other ways for the participant to be engaged. We live in a digital world. Like, is there a way for you to ask the participant questions on video and present a video to the space so that it's a very controlled environment? Is there a way for you to set up questions with whoever they're talking to in advance and really prep the participant on this is what's going to be asked, so that they can speak freely? Like, we're not trying to control or get certain answers from them or any of those things. We want them to have the ability to speak freely, but we also have it in a controlled and safe environment of they know exactly what's going to be asked of them, and have walked through those questions so that nothing comes up that's out of what the participant has been prepared or engaged for. I think those are kind of the two biggest ones. And then also just saying, prepping your audience. If you're taking them to a city council meeting, sending city council an email beforehand and saying, hey, this is this individual. They have a couple barriers like that we're going to name, but I do think that this is what they bring to our system, and prepping the audience as much as you're prepping the individual so it can be a safe and like productive meeting of the two. And that will also then gain reputation almost for future engagement of when you want to bring other individuals with lived experience or highlight other voices in the space, is that everybody has a more trusting and understanding relationship of what's going to happen.
Thank you. There was a question in the chat. I don't know if you have that up, but basically, Paula had asked, they live in a more rural setting and they're trying to build some housing and their behavioral health agency. Specifically, they asked, can you explain how you have persons with lived experience serve on advisory boards when sometimes they're difficult to contact or maybe find in a rural setting like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a little bit different between the two different advisory groups. Open meetings, we can have a very variety of people that are coming in. People can come in once and then choose not to engage again. Of course, that's the model with all of them, but we set our advisory committees same day, same time, same place every month, which I know that seems like it does take some of the contacting them or finding them to encourage that to still happen, because days and times can get really confusing and all of those things, but that consistency does allow for some benefits, I guess, of like, hey, like, let's engage you in this process. Also meeting them where they are at. We'd have some individuals that aren't necessarily engaged in the advisory committee yet, but that we're meeting one-on-one. So like they can come to our people with lived experience coordinator anytime that she's free, right? So they stop by her office whenever they choose and start building that relationship so that we can kind of get them engaged in the advisory group when they're ready. But we want to build that relationship on their time frame and when they are comfortable, before engaging them in the big group per se. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything else. It can be hard. And also just understanding, like, you don't have to be at every meeting. Encouraging them to show up when they're able and not necessarily like, oh, you missed a meeting. Like it's, oh, something else came up that day, but like you're able to be here 2/3 of the time. Like that's awesome.
Questions, guys? It's a big, sometimes when I think about systems and what all the things that we can do and the things that get in the way, like it's a large thing, like it's a lot to take in sometimes. So we'll stay on for a little bit in case you guys have questions and you want to ask, maybe in a smaller group. But for the folks of you who are here, thank you for attending. Thank you for participating in the chat. Thank you for being present. We have, of course, another one in a month, and we'll see you then. But you're welcome to stay on and ask Morgan any questions if you'd like. Thanks, guys.